So, as we close our first evening, let's set aside the assumption that intelligence lives only in brains. I'd like to invite the moderator of the next panel, Rethinking Intelligence Beyond the Brain, Professor Ruth DeFries, Ecology and Sustainable Development at Columbia University. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. We are at the last panel, and I would like to invite Paco and Morten up to the stage, please. Okay, and we've been talking ahead of time, so I know you all are in for a treat to hear from them. I'll briefly introduce them. Morten, and please correct if any of this is wrong, Kringelbach is a professor of neuroscience at Aarhus University and is director at the Center of Eudaimonia and Human Flourishing at the fellow Linacre College. Welcome. And Professor Paco Calvo, if any of you were able to attend his talk last night, it was an absolute treat and delight. Paco is a professor of philosophy of science at the University of Murcia, Spain. Apologies for any mispronunciations. So we have 39 minutes here, and this is our last session of the day, so we want to wrap up what we've learned and prepare ourselves for tomorrow. So what we'll do is hear a bit from Morten and Paco about their fascinating work, one on the brain, human brain, and the other on plants, fascinating. And then we'd like to ask you all a question, and then have some Q&A here, and in the last few minutes have a little bit of time for your short, crisp questions. So, Morten, would you like to start and give some words about your reflections and your own work?
Well, yes, of course. One of the things, of course, is fantastic is to be back in Athens. And this morning we had the pleasure of being at the Lyceum. And as you can imagine, somebody who runs a center for Eudaimonia and human flourishing in Oxford, it was great to be back at the source. Although, of course, he did it in only merely 10 years, and then he was sent on his way. One of the things that has come through very clearly in this is that there's, of course, a lot of intelligence in this world. And as we heard from the other panels, there are many ways of defining intelligence. One of the things I took away from the last lecture, beautiful lecture, was that nature can teach us a lot about what it is. So today we are talking about the sort of entanglement of these three kinds of AIs, the animate, and the ancestral, and the artificial one. And I'd like to propose, and this is really what my work is about, and what Aristotle, I think, would agree with, and we heard that from the first panel, that he was really inspired by nature, just like we heard from the previous speaker. He was inspired by the kinds of things that nature has invented. And the key thing that nature invented was this idea of survival. What are the kind of things that make you survive? And perhaps another A here to throw at you, and we can maybe discuss that, is the word effective. And maybe that is in fact what underlies, at the very least, the animate and the ancestral. What is it about these things, the fact that I have to make a quick decision about what it is that I need to do in order to survive, and not just for me to survive, but for my kin to survive. And so that really is the kind of thing that evolution has built over these years. And of course the question then becomes, to what extent is that true of artificial intelligence? To what extent is that something that helps us with our affective intelligences? And also I think one of the things, of course, that we need to talk about is, what about the future? How do we align with a different, perhaps, kind of intelligence? Although I'd love to show that beautiful drawing that Jadvinda had. We can maybe even do the kind of thing that Nikki did so well. We could ask people, you know, how many of you think that this idea of having effective intelligence could underlie all three of them? Maybe we could have a show of hands of how many thinks that could be a potential unifier. Anybody? There's one, so that must be a great idea, yes? But because, of course, the other thing about this thing about having effective intelligence is that you have to be an agent, just as Yetvinda was speaking about. But of course, and this is where I'm going to stop for a moment, because I think it works much better if, rather than monologuing, and leave it to Paco to tell us about to what extent that might or might not be true in the kind of plants that you're working with.
Oh my God, hold on a sec, let me rewind. Hi, great to be here. And well, first, I think I have a confession to make. Especially, it feels kind of weird to be here on stage after the previous, not the last talk, the previous one by the Google sustainability guy, with all these apps that you can use, right? And I don't have a cell phone, right? So I was feeling kind of dumb, like, oh, all these amazing apps, and I can't do anything with them because I don't have a cell phone, right? But I can tell you what my students do with their cell phones. We have a lab, we set up a lab like 10 years ago plus, and we observe plant behavior, right? We observe plant behavior. And of course, plants are slow, so we have to speed them up, right? Through time-lapse photography. So you can grab your cell phone, those of you who have a cell phone, you can do what my students do. So on a Friday, they set it up, let's say a picture every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes, off they go for the weekend, and they come back on the Monday morning and say, oh, let's check it out what the plant did over the weekend, right? You just assemble the footage and watch it, right? And that's something here that really bothers me about this approach, about machine intelligence. The Democritus director said something at the opening. You said something like, machine intelligence without entanglement by itself is meaningless, detached from the human connection, right? Something like that. And this morning at the Lyceum, thinking of Darwin, by the way, he was able to observe plant behavior to the naked eye, So instead of speeding plants up, he was slowing himself down to observe plant behavior at plant's own pace, right? So that's one message I tell my students, like please, before you, of course we do that. We have to get the data, we do the hypothesis testing, so we have all those means. But those means by themselves mean nothing, because what really bothers me is that as of 2026, with all the technology in the world, we still do not appreciate intelligence that doesn't sit in a brain, for example, right? And these are things that Darwin was able to appreciate to the naked eye, right? So that's one part of the story. We also heard about the Gaia theory, right? And I love this quote from James Lovelock. So, can you imagine if what can you do? Because Darwin wasn't chopping some plant tissue off and putting on the Petri dish. No, he was checking out plant behavior as such. But if you put some plant tissue in the Petri dish, James Locke reminds you that what you get to know is you get to know more and more about less and less, right? So getting to your question, this affective side of things has to do, I would call it meaning making. So these complex systems have got to be in the business of meaning making. So there has got to be some positioning, what the world looks like from their vantage perspective. You cannot do that on behalf of somebody else. It's got to be yourself, right? So certainly we can help ourselves by these technologies, we can use them, but unless we truly entangle them, we will never be able to meaning make, I would say, biosemiotics, to interact, right? So that's, to me, one of the issues. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. So a question for you all, now that you've had a bit of time to think about it. I think in this room, we can all agree that there are useful applications of AI for monitoring and predicting floods and helping with decisions. Okay, let's agree on that. And I think we can all agree that the problems we face in the world are because we have the human economic and governance system has such a focus on efficiency, short term, and extraction of resources to assume unlimited extent. Can everybody agree with that? Anybody disagree with that? I think we all agree on that. So the question is whether you think AI, flip the question that we heard about the interesting things that Google is doing, flip that around, and do you think AI can help us learn about the wisdom of nature and the wisdom of ancestral intelligence to help with our human economic and governance systems incorporate the learnings from ancestral and animate intelligence? Do you think we will see that day?
Some show of hands. Yes.
You are nodding?
A few. I don't know. Adam, is Adam still here? What do you think? Yes, thumbs up.
Can I say something on this? Right?
Yeah, please.
Because, there's something that bothers me here. So I would qualify my nodding, okay? And it has to do with something that came out actually in the Oxford panel, the banana panel, right? Which, by the way, banana moderator, natural selection, so those bananas have no seeds, right? So it's difficult to put them together with natural selection, right? But information processing, so if we put this idea of how can we make use of AI to solve all these problems, the problem that I see is that we are coaching it in terms of information processing. That was one of the terms that came up here, right? So information processing. And to me, the problem we have with this label is that it sort of conveys the idea that the environment is inherently poor, and I process the information to deliver the solution, right? So it's like this computer metaphor. And I think we could rethink what we mean by information processing by questioning that the environment is inherently poor. It's not something that you have to enrich computationally. So AIs are okay if we don't see them as in the business of enriching something that is inherently poor. It is not poor when we think in terms of interacting with environment. So it's in the coupling of agents, affective agents with the surroundings that we find a rich behavioral repertoire. Only there. That's where you can do this process of meaning making, right? But it's not like the solution is being cooked up in somebody's head, right? That's the problem. This intelligence doesn't sit there. It's the emergent result of all these interactions that have brains, artificial means, bodily constraints, and environmental settings.
And so if I could sort of speak for the machines, a bit like the Lorex, I speak for the trees. Of course, there's nothing to say that AI couldn't have bodies. They couldn't have this kind of thing. And again, at dinner last night, we spoke about, and I asked you, what would be the main, because one of the problems, of course, with what we call AI now is it's entirely language-based. It's learning from the language that we have, and that's how it appears intelligent. Could there be a bit like politicians that sound very intelligent, but there's nothing in there? Or is it, no, that was a joke. But I asked you, what do you think of the many kind of things that plants do? And we heard earlier from the banana panel, and can I just say with all the minions in the room, banana, right? What is it about those tips that Merlin Sheldrake and others have discovered, these waves of activity, these fingertips? Could one potentially learn from nature? And again, that's, I think, a really important part here. If we did what Aristotle did, namely to learn from nature, I think we could potentially develop something which may not be intelligent in the way that we are or plants are, but maybe there's something to learn. Maybe there's a thing.
No, well, definitely. I mean, in fact, I don't think of a plant or a tree as an individual processing information, but it's more like a pattern of collective intelligence. All these tips doing their self-organized business, right? And interacting with the local environment in a meaningful way, right? So actually, we can take this to the way we are using generative AIs, because we are simply thinking of smart prompt engineering and seeing what the gadget responds. But let's move out of AI onto robotics, right? So robotics, I mean real guys out there doing things in the world, right? So like these dogs, these robotic dogs moving around and doing things. It's a different thing from simply talking about the AI. So if we speak of the inspiration from plants or fungi in terms of collective intelligence, I would envisage, like, imagine these robots controlled by these generative AIs in such a way that they have to not simply behave out there and see what happens when they move out. So this robot moves, whoops, what happened there? Out of my pattern of locomotion. Oh, okay, but not just me with respect to the local environment, but other agents, other artificial agents having to organize with each other in an emergent fashion. So those emergent patterns are what we see in plants, in tree roots, in fungi. So we can certainly learn from them to fine-tune the way collective dynamics operate in plant-inspired or...
And can we maybe also talk about something that Adam raised as well, the idea of how much energy is needed for intelligence. I think one of the great things about all of the animals on this earth is that we have a finite budget, namely the kind of energy that comes into the earth. And I don't know whether you thought about it, but this is what my research is about. I put people in scanners and I try to work out, to reverse engineer what happens in the brains of people when they solve problems. And the key thing that comes out is that we live on bananas, a banana and a bit of water, and we work, like the Minions would say, banana. It's a far cry from the kind of technology that a lot of the generative AI is using, and of course it's one of the major problems that we need to think about. If we are going to rethink intelligence, how can we build agents, intelligent agents, with the kind of tricks that nature has come up with? Are there ways of doing that? And in fact, we've recently published some work that shows that the way that the brain works is very different, even though it has neural networks, just as you see in AI. But it turns out it works on something called interference. And that interference uses a lot less energy. So there's nothing, and you can read these papers if you're interested, you can see there's nothing that wouldn't stop us from built things that are very much like that. Or if not, we could use the kind of things that you see in your work or in other works.
So that gets at my question, but first I want to say, eat your bananas. Eat them now, because there's such low genetic diversity in bananas that, and they're so vulnerable.
Even though it has no seeds, I'm going to pass the baton, pass the banana.
Oh, chicken man.
A collective energy.
It's slightly worn, but still intelligent.
So it's not the banana that doesn't have intelligence. It's the humans who...
It's we.
Yeah, that created this system where there is just one very low diversity kind of banana in this world. So eat them now. But your response, Morten, gets to the question that I wanted to ask you, and that is based on your own work. You work on the human brain, fascinating work. You work on plants, Paco, fascinating work. And I'm apologizing for asking you to anthropomorphize this a bit. Okay. What do you take from your work that helps us in flourishing, in human flourishing and life flourishing? What do you take from your work that helps us on a kind of, maybe not as practical of a level, the wonderful work from Emmanuel and the fantastic reefs from Nikki, but what do we take as a practical lesson from your work?
Maybe I could go to West Africa. I don't know how many of you have been to West Africa. There's a country there called Senegal, which is the one that is closest to the Americas. And in there, there's about 96% of the people there speak some kind of French, beautiful French, but different from the kind of French that you would know otherwise. But they also speak a language called Wolof. Now, in this language, when they speak about music, they have the same word for music and dance. They just have different genres. But they also have a proverb, which is Nit nitai karabam. People are people's medicine. And in all my work, in all the work that I've done looking at what happens in our brains, is really that social connection. And it's even more beautiful than that, and this is going to link directly to Paco, because you see the word garap, the root of that is not just medicine, it's tree medicine, like in many indigenous cultures. So really people are people's trees. And I think we're not just each other's trees, but we're also deeply linked to other beings. I had the great joy of, with Banana Boy, who came up here earlier, we both happened to live in Oxford, and we went off into the south of England to hear a good friend of ours, Sam Lee, who is an extraordinary artist who you can look up on Spotify. He does something quite extraordinary. He takes people on journeys into the coppiced woods, where even though they are about 95% less now than they were just 10 years ago, the nightingales, this amazing bird that sings through the night, and by the way, comes from West Africa, where Nitnitai Garabam is a saying. They don't sing there, they just live in the thrush. But when they are there, you actually can sing with them. And this is what he did to us. At midnight, we walked without cell phones, without light, into the darkness. And we were there, huddled up, while he was singing not just to the nightingale, but with the nightingale. Because what you see, the nightingale is singing and is able to change the way that they sing, which is extraordinary, right? The improvisation, the joy, the meaning-making you get there. And one of the things I think that comes out of that, if you then think about not just within people, but across species, and perhaps even with these new things. Lots of people, of course, now use AI to use as partners. It's sort of impoverished, but it's a way of reaching out.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, actually, in my case, one thing I already mentioned, and I'm not kidding, we can learn a great lesson from plants, which is to chill out. No, but I mean it. You see, when I tell my students, hey, why don't you watch plant growth to the naked eye? They think I've gone bananas. Because they say, come on, I mean, they are so bloody slow. Do you want me to sit on a stool and watch the plant for how? You know, they are way faster than we think. I've done it. So I've put like a climbing bean. I study climbing plants, right? You say, imagine you stick a pole and then you just check whether the plant is simply growing and then boops, bumping onto the pole by chance or trying to reach out for it, right? So we try to study whether there is some form of intelligence in the pole reaching behavior. But a full revolution takes like an hour. So you can be watching a movie for 2 hours and don't complain, or on your screens watching cats for 20 hours and don't, but then, no, I'm not going to be watching a plant grow. I mean, what can be more boring than watching grass grow, right? So when you do that, you realize that you are able to empathize in a manner that you wouldn't be able to otherwise. And I mean it. When I watch time-lapse footage, you forget that we are assembling the footage, say 20 frames per second, I take a picture every minute. So that means that you are, in a second, you're having 20 minutes of real time. You are missing 99.9% of real action in the footage you have assembled. But when you watch it to the naked eye, you get something else. You truly get the appreciation of the effort that the climbing being is making to reach out for the pole. You do get to see it. It's like a film, 2 hours, right? So that's a good lesson to chill out and slow down, right? We are far too hectic and, this fast lifestyle. But the other lesson is that when we speak of intelligence sitting in the brain, and then we complain that plants have no brain or neural tissue, then we forget that we are way more decentralized than we thought we were. So, in a sense, we are all already plant-like. We just haven't realized yet. So we are way more decentralized. Cognition doesn't reside within the skull. It's something that, it's embodied, is embedded. It requires a whole body. So it's not information processing through neural tissue. It's way more than that, right? So I think that plants give you a good reason to rethink yourself, and not simply to understand plant intelligence in its own terms, but to rethink what we mean by our own intelligence.
What do you think of that, Morten? What the parallel between plant intelligence and the human brain?
I think it's really interesting, and I think you're absolutely right. Of course we are embodied. And of course one of the things that we do in my center, we have a thing called the Flourishing Intelligence Program, which is all about seeing whether we could actually interact with these other kinds of intelligences, in this case AI, but it could be plants, bring them down to the scale that you're talking about. And not just in the case of AI, talk to them, but actually find different ways of engaging with them through bodies, which is entirely possible. It just so happens that at the moment, nobody's really doing it, partly because it costs so much money. But now imagine that you could create intelligences either from the plant-like kind of intelligence or from the human, less energy kind of thing. Then we'll have these agents that we need to combine in some way and try to understand what it's like to be them, yes? And I think that, for me, is one of the most exciting things about it. It's like, going to a very different place. And then I think, and this is where your final slide in your talk, your beautiful talk, was where we saw how the animate, the ancestral, and the artificial started to truly entangle. And I think that's the challenge. How do we actually entangle things? And I mean entanglement in the sense that we use in quantum mechanics, the way that one cannot be thought about the other. I think it's wrong at this point to dismiss AI in any form. It's going to stay here. But I think we need to do something with it that actually enhances human flourishing. And that's the big question, that's the big challenge. How do we make AI that actually makes us flourishing?
So, if I may add, that's really interesting, because I think that entanglement will take place when we realize that what's truly uniting us, animate, ancestral, artificial, is nothing that sits within our body limits. So because we are all made of different implementations, different materials, different organizations, different topologies. So it's not about, so we shouldn't get obsessed with thinking, what is it that we share, right? We might be very unlike each other. So what we do share is the world that we inhabit. And I think that's the key. I mean, one example, we've discussed this before, right? This was circadian clocks. Right? So any form of life whatsoever, from cyanobacteria doing photosynthesis to Homo sapiens, we all evolved circadian clocks to tell the time of day, right? And they are very different. So the implementation is very different. Different types of clocks, different molecular clocks. So if you were to look again with James Lovelock idea of to know more and more about less and less into the Petri dish, you wouldn't find anything that relates those clocks to one another. Completely different, molecularly speaking. And yet, we can entangle them. The entanglement has to do with what we do share. And what we share is the world that we inhabit. So the sun sets and the sun rises for any form of life whatsoever, right? In all those temporal scales. So by realizing that it is the stage that life and intelligence is unfolding on those temporal scales is where we find the room to perform, to inactivate that entanglement.
Yeah. So I would say that the entanglement occurs, or the learning occurs, when there are shocks on that outside environment that all of these types of intelligences are encountering. So the frequency of shocks is a determinant of how quickly a system can evolve and learn principles, which is where I want to get to your question for you, Morten, that AI is kind of a shock on our cultural social systems, right? And I know some of your work is about using your understanding of the human brain to identify mental health, predict mental health. So do you think there's some synergy there with the shock on children and people's lives from AI and your ability to understand?
Well, there's no doubt that this technology that we've invented, like any technology, can be misused. And it has been misused. I think the way that a lot of, and this is not artificial intelligence, this is basically people making crack cocaine in the form of apps, right? And we know for a fact, because I know these people that have developed them, they develop these apps to be as addictive as possible, for you to spend as much time possible so that you can become the product and that you can use your parents' credit card in order to do this, right? So the question is, we've invented this technology, we'll have to roll it back, like with any intelligent system, they are maladaptive things, and we will roll them back. Then the question becomes, can we, and this is one of the things we've discovered, is that just like any system which is in non-equilibrium, and remember, and this I think Javinda again was right on the money there, any system that is in equilibrium is a system that is dead. This is not how the world works. We are a non-equilibrium system. We're constantly changing, but there are different trajectories that we can take. And it turns out that when we become depressed, if you use the right kind of way of looking at your activity, we can determine much earlier. We've just published some research that shows that in adolescents, for whatever reason, we can look at their brains, take a brain scan, and we can see that there's a little bit of rust on the bicycle that they use in their brain. And we can predict, genuine prediction a year later, who is going to go on to be depressed. Now, the challenge for us is how do we then use that time in a good way? How do we make sure that they are, in fact, each other's medicine? How do we intervene in a way that makes them feel, and again, we're back to Aristotle, eudaimonia. And that eudaimonia, I would say, really works with other people. And that, I think, is the challenge. But at the same time, it's not that much of a challenge, because anyone who spent any time with children knows that the key thing to that is play. The kind of play that, of course, also to some extent happens in many other systems. And one thing I'd like to say about the intelligence, maybe play, and I don't know how you feel about this as an audience, the ability to play is a really good way of thinking about intelligence. The curiosity, the fun, right? And then I would always add kindness. So the KFC, not the chicken man here, but the KFC, kindness, fun, and curiosity.
I thought you were going to say, do plants have fun?
Yeah, I'm sure plants have fun.
So from that perspective, but I'm interested in that because I think, you see it in a lot, I don't know whether you know this, but it's been shown that mice have this high frequency sound they emit when they're really happy. So they're laughing in some sense, right? I mean, it's just that we haven't been able to pick it up. I'm just kind of wondering what happens in ecosystems with plants. Do you think that there's some kind of, and maybe not fun, because fun requires an agency and so on, but do you think that what happens here is that they are kind of mucking about?
Well, definitely. I mean, you can tell the difference if you look at, if you go in a tropical forest, a primary forest, and you see all the richness related to the interactions in between all those species, plant and non-plant, right? As opposed to the type of crops that you find, of domesticated plants lined up.
But usually that's framed in the sense of, the survival of the fittest and so on. But do you think there's an element of play there as well?
Yeah. That's what I mean. No, definitely. So take one example that we spoke about that last night. It was the shade avoidance, right? So think of a plant growing in isolation. So an isolated potted plant, simply growing in a lab to check something out, some of these things we do to them. Like, that's a boring environment for the plant. It's not a fun environment. Now, if that seedling is growing with many fellows in such a way that they need to keep, because if you see growth is always, that's the term Darwin coined, circumnutation, right? So it's got to be oscillating. They don't grow in a straight line, right? So there is always differential growth. So any plant organ will grow like making these revolutions, right? So you will find a collectivity, grass, whatever, and you'll have all these individuals doing their own dance, and they will organize with respect to the others. Say shade avoidance, if I want to reach out and do my own photosynthesis or whatever. And certainly you can put that in terms of energy. In fact, we do two things, not just time-lapse photography to observe the over behavior, but we also insert the electrodes and check out the electrical activity going on within the plant tissue. And at that level, you can actually use the very same metrics you use in animals. So when you speak of complexity, of entropy, when you use all these metrics, it is the very same toolkit that you can use. So if it makes sense at all, let me put it this way, if it makes sense at all to speak in those terms for mice, you have the same toolkit. You just need to customize it for non-neural systems. But it would make sense.
So there's a really interesting thing here going on, right? So we have these organisms that somehow have to make sense of their environment. And there are many ways, and nature has evolved all these different ways. At the moment, we've then invented the technology you know, I was trained as a computer science many, many years ago. And in those days, what we call artificial intelligence was a joke, right? Many of us were working in artificial networks, and I don't think many of us had realized that the moment we scaled it up, that we would get what we actually have gotten. But I think it's also now time to be more inspired by what it is that we see in nature, because of course these artificial networks that have become what we call AI are inspired by the brain, but maybe they're not enough inspired, and maybe they shouldn't just look to the brain, but they should look exactly to the kinds of solutions that happens elsewhere in the system.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, go for your final word, and then we'll open for some questions.
No, I was going to say that's very interesting because, in fact, it connects real nicely to the last talk on the materials, right? The material inspiration. Because we can find inspiration not just on the materials themselves, but on the actual behaviors. So we can design robots inspired on plant behavior. Like we call them growbots, robots that grow. And here you see the payoff. Like, I mean, if you think of a rover on wheels, that rover will have to care about the crack, not to get stuck in the crack. But if you're a growbot, you grow over the crack. So plant inspiration can give you very neat designs, right? So you solve the problem, not solve it, by growing out of your problems.
Yeah. Huh. Fascinating. Okay, any crisp, short questions? We have a few minutes.
There's a microphone coming to you, behind you.
There we go.
Fascinating. So there was a lot of talk about previously as well, and now how to use artificial intelligence. And I might be a little cynical, maybe just a little, but is there an element that will never be able to be used? And I will explain what I mean. To be used. I will explain right now what I mean. You said the connection you get to the information from the plant by observing it. And that's something between you and the plant, and you need the time, the patience, and the effort to get some sort of knowledge that technology should not intervene in that process. And today, very randomly, I was also thinking that we are becoming very stupid, and that's something everyone is talking about, as AI makes us more stupid, because we have direct access to information. So we are disassociated from the effort of finding information. Instead of thinking, I want to read about that, so you go to the library, you really try hard to find the book, you find the book, you try hard to find the knowledge. This process is part of the knowledge, is connecting you to the end result. And you learn through that, and you connect the same way you connect to the plant. Not just the information about what you get from the plant. You have a relationship with the information and the object that gives you that information, and as an individual or as a book or whatever it is. So if AI is intervening in that process, do we lose that connection? And if so, should we limit that and keep the connection? Or should we find ways to make that connection happen through AI? I'm done.
So if I can paraphrase your question, maybe not correctly, can AI ever be comparable to animate intelligence and ancestral intelligence?
Mike, I don't think so by itself, but simply because it has to do with software. We would have to move into the hardware. The great ideas, in the good old days, you came up with a great idea when you were doing the dishes, before we had dishwashers, right? So the catch is that if we are fast in retrieving information, the problem is that we end up working on 20 papers rather than having that one paper done and then go for a walk and think in the good old way. So, but we want to be even more productive, and that never ends. That's the catch.
I think there's a really great question in there about exploration and about the getting lost and finding out about things yourself. But I think there's also, and I would personally see that of course we can have other intelligences because we can build them just like us. And there's nothing stopping us. They could have bodies. It's only our imagination that will stop us. And I think the other thing that Aristotle would say is that any new kind of technology is something that frees you up to do other things. I mean, one of the great things about the Neolithic revolution was that we didn't have to be hunter and gatherers. We had a lot of free time so that we become like Aristotle. And I think we are at the same point here. This is another technology. At the same time, the key thing about technology is it's just another word for something that doesn't quite work yet, right?
Okay, great place to stop. Some different perspectives between the two of you. We have 24 more seconds, and I want to take that to thank you all. It's been an absolutely fascinating day, and it will be an equally fascinating tomorrow.
Great timing.
Thank you so much. That brings our first evening to a close. Thank you for being part of this opening on Animate Intelligence. We'll see you back here tomorrow morning at 9:45 as we will pass to the next chapter from the intelligence of ecosystems to the wisdom of our ancestors. Good night and safe travel back home.